years on, and I'm still baffled by the decision to split Dead Reckoning into 2 parts.
You must be out of your mind.
I tend to feel like 2-parters are a bad idea in general, but attempting one in a franchise like Mission Impossible was hubris of the highest order. When you split a story into 2 halves, you're essentially electing to deny the audience a degree of gratification. Sure, you can construct a part 1 that broadly fits the 3-act structure and arrives as a sufficient climax, but there's no way around the fact that you're ultimately withholding the payoff. It's just inherent to the concept. For most stories, that's a hard compromise to sell, but it's downright antithetical to the ethos of Mission Impossible. Clocking in at a hefty 2 hours and 43 minutes, Dead Reckoning Part 1 spends most of its protracted runtime treading water to avoid advancing the plot too far. Ethan Hunt and his team spend an eye-watering amount of time chasing a key that we never see being used. The film's central villain, a rogue AI known as the Entity, never meaningfully advances its agenda, and most, if not all, of the major subplots are still dangling by the time the credits roll. It plays like an extended tease for the real story. Yet, being the fan of these films that I am, I was still optimistic Part 2 could right the ship. Cruise and McQuarrie have proven time and time again that they're competent storytellers. They know what makes a film compelling, and their collaborations have consistently produced excellence. Dead Reckoning was a miss, but everyone misses once in a while, right? Right? Like, at the very least, Part 2 would have to be better than Part 1 for the simple fact that all of the unpleasant scene setting was out of the way, right? For all its faults, its predecessor had done the hard work. It had set up the pins, and now all Part 2 would have to do is knock them down. Hell, depending on how well they tied things up, Part 2 had the potential to make Part 1 feel more cohesive in retrospect. But alas, that wound up being wishful thinking. Instead of staying the course on the 2-parter they began, The Final Reckoning comes off like a desperate attempt to salvage a sinking ship for parts. The Final Reckoning wants to be free of its predecessor while still resolving the storyline it inherited from it. But in trying to have its cake and eat it too, this 8th and supposedly final entry in the Mission Impossible franchise is the one that finally derails the train completely, resulting in a mess so confounding it genuinely made me nostalgic for the relative simplicity and narrative clarity of Dead Reckoning Part 1. So I guess Part 2 really did make Part 1 better in hindsight after all. I realize it's not exactly popular to suggest that one of these movies can be outright bad, but whatever you think of the previous 7 missions, The Final Reckoning is easily the worst one, and by a pretty wide margin at that. Were this film part of any other franchise, it would be getting dragged through the mud right now, and rightfully so, but it's not. And so, instead, it's receiving mixed reviews at worst. But make no mistake, this is a massive bum note to end what has otherwise been an exceptional series of films, and I don't think it should get a pass just for having a few good action scenes. For all of his many personal flaws, to put it nicely, Tom Cruise has set an extremely high bar for himself, and The Final Reckoning simply doesn't pass muster. That might be difficult to accept, but in the wise words of Mission Commander Swanbeck,
well, this is not mission difficult, Mr. Hunt. It's mission impossible. Difficult should be a walk in the park for you.
So let's take a walk in the park, shall we? But before we do, I just have one question for you. Did you know your data is being harvested? No, not by a rogue AI bent on world domination, by data brokers, large, shadowy companies that collect and analyze personal information from across the web to build a digital profile of you that you can then license or sell to other private entities for a tidy profit. And because anyone can purchase this data from these brokers, it could very easily wind up in the wrong hands, resulting in you becoming the victim of identity theft, phishing scams, or targeted harassment like doxing and stalking. And yeah, that doesn't sound great.
Turn left.
But hold on, because you don't have to go full Luddite like Luther and Benji here. Rather than destroying all of my personal devices, which leaves all of my data online and ready for collection, I use today's sponsor, Delete Me, to manage all of my online information. With Delete Me's easy-to-use dashboard, I can keep track of which sites have my information and request to have that data removed, all with the click of a button. It's like having your very own guardian angel watching over you and erasing your digital footprints before ne'er-do-wells can get their hands on your information. Like, seriously, look at this. This is all of my personal data that was out on the internet, and Delete Me managed to just get rid of all of it. It was super easy. I filled out a forum, asked a bunch of questions, very straightforward questions, and within a matter of like days, really. I got this privacy report back and they managed to save me a lot of time, effort, and, keep my information out of the hands of the followers of Gabriel. I'm trying, guys, I'm trying. So what are you waiting for? Sign up for Delete Me today and take control of your personal data today. And if you go to joindeleteme.com/filmspeak and use promo code FilmSpeak at checkout, you'll get 20% off your plan. That's joindeleteme.com/filmspeak. Use code FilmSpeak at checkout and get 20% off, save your data, get free of the digital entities trying to control your lives, and feel better about yourself. And thank you so much to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the mission. When you think Mission Impossible, what immediately comes to mind? I'm willing to bet it's either the high-octane action set pieces, stuff like the Burj Khalifa climb in Ghost Protocol and the helicopter chase in Fallout, or the intricate suspense sequences, think the CIA vault heist in MI1, or the Vatican infiltration in MI3. These moments are the bedrock on which the franchise was built, and they're as intrinsic to its identity as Tom Cruise or Lalo Schifrin. Yet, for a series that has earned a reputation of delivering pulse-pounding thrills, the first hour and a half of The Final Reckoning is unforgivably tedious. I've seen the movie twice now, and on the second viewing, I decided to time certain sequences just to test whether or not my perception was warped. And no, the first set piece of the film doesn't occur until an hour and 20 minutes in, a few minutes shy of that midway point, other than Luther's death, which comes out of nowhere and feels incredibly unearned, particularly because they try to soften the blow by suddenly revealing he's dying of cancer anyway. Very little of consequence actually happens. Of all the Final Reckoning's failings, it's this tactical retreat from its predecessor that stands out as its original sin. From the moment The Final Reckoning starts, it's extremely obvious the film is operating under the assumption you didn't see part 1. Not only do characters repeatedly reiterate the events of that film in nauseating detail, but McQuarrie punctuates these overt references with a comedic number of flashbacks, just in case the oh-so-subtle dialogue eluded you. On some level, I get it, right? Dead Reckoning underperformed, yet you've committed to resolving its storyline in the next entry, so you need to make sure everyone understands the state of play before you can get going. But surely there was a more elegant way to go about it. Another notable instance of this penchant for retcon is Shea Whigham's character, Jasper Briggs, who's back at Kittredge's right hand after standing up to him at the end of the previous film to reluctantly work alongside Ethan to save the day. One of the final moments of that film is Briggs racing to stop Ethan from escaping and then refusing to shoot him as he gets away. Despite the implication of bad blood between them, the moment suggested that a seed of understanding is starting to sprout within Briggs. In The Final Reckoning, that nuance is all but forgotten, and he's back to his grudge as if they had never had that encounter. But what makes Briggs worth noting is what McQuarrie does with his backstory. As it turns out, Jasper Briggs isn't the man's real name. No, that would be Jim Phelps, as in Jim Phelps Jr., the son of Ethan's traitorous mentor in the first Mission Impossible. Jim Phelps, Sr.? Dude, when this happened, I nearly fell out of my goddamn chair. Talk about some Rise of Skywalker-ass glup shitto nonsense. Jim Phelps Jr. is a stupid reveal because it means absolutely nothing and goes nowhere. Some have tried to defend the decision by arguing it speaks to the film's broader theme of consequences. As the quote-unquote final chapter in the series, The Final Reckoning devotes a lot of time to the idea that good deeds can have unintended consequences and that we must bear responsibility for these consequences. This idea is perhaps best reflected in another retcon the film throws into the mix, which is that the rabbit's foot from MI3 was actually a primordial version of the entity. We learn that when Ethan stole it to save Julia, he accidentally set off a chain reaction that led to the rise of the digital anti-god. Let me be clear. I think it's incredibly stupid to retcon something that was explicitly shown to be a bioweapon into the entity. It's sloppy, even by retcon standards, and only serves to undermine another filmmaker's directorial intent. In any case, this change, however stupid, succinctly communicates the film's point about unintended repercussions, as does the return of William Donlow, who, despite being the gluppiest of shittos ever put to screen, is actually a pretty solid addition to the cast and even gets a nice moment where he recontextualizes Ethan's guilt. When Ethan goes to apologize for how his actions unintentionally ruined Donlow's career, Donlow assures him that there's nothing to apologize for. What from the outside looks like collateral damage is actually the thing that brought him to his soulmate. But yeah, when you lay it all out like that, it's no wonder there's so much exposition in the first half of this film. There's just way too much going on, and because a lot of it has no basis in part 1, it all has to be established ASAP. So much for knocking down the pins that were already set up. The film seems to think the audience is full of mouth-breathing morons who would forget to blink without frequent flashbacks instructing them on how to do so. It's more than a little ironic that the line from this film people have chosen to meme to death is,
I need you to trust me. One last time.
because for as much as this movie expects you to blindly trust Ethan Hunt, and by extension Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie, it's abundantly clear that neither of these men trust the audience one iota. For example, once the film runs out of scenes from the previous film to flashback to, The Final Reckoning just starts flashing back to earlier moments in The Final Reckoning. I shit you not. I know that between the poison pill, the Sevastopol, the Podkova, the 5D drive, and the Doomsday Bunker, this film has way too many MacGuffins to keep track of, but did we really need so many flashbacks to Gabriel taking the poison pill from Luther? One massive problem with The Final Reckoning is that the entity is kind of a non-entity for most of the runtime. While I had issues with how the entity was portrayed in Dead Reckoning, it felt ever-present and inescapable. Sadly, none of that is true in The Final Reckoning. Bizarrely, the entity feels somewhat sidelined. When Ethan arrives in London, we see widespread civil unrest. The city, like many others, is under martial law, but then this never factors into the story again. The opening of this film establishes a worldwide shift in the status quo. We've entered the entity's reality, and yet we barely get to see what this new reality looks like. And more important to my point, neither does Grace. Grace comes to this massive revelation about how they need to undo the damage the entity did, but why? What prompted that change of heart? We never see her encounter that damage or come to understand that some versions of the entity will be needed to reverse the harm it's done. She never confronts a cultist or gets duped by one of the entity's deceptions. She just comes to that conclusion off screen, which is such shockingly lazy character writing that it undercuts everything that follows. This is presumably the conversation that shifts Ethan's thinking on the matter, but it fails to resonate because it's totally unearned. Overall, I'm pretty comfortable calling Gabriel the weakest villain in the series. Yes, even weaker than Colonel Hendricks, who I'm betting you forgot. The man is laughably underdeveloped. He wasn't great in Dead Reckoning, but at least his motives were coherent. He was the entity's dark messiah. We didn't know what animated that devotion, but it was easy enough to follow. In The Final Reckoning, Gabriel is a cartoon character. Forsaken by his god, he now seeks to control the entity so he can build a new world, which only further confounds his loyalty to the entity in the previous films. Was controlling the entity always the plan? What does this new world he wants to build look like? Why does he want to build it? What, if anything, does he believe? All questions without answers. He's barely in the film, so, I guess McQuarrie figured his motives weren't worth exploring. And like I said before, the entity doesn't pick up much of the slack. Within minutes, The Final Reckoning establishes that the entity endgame is to take control of the world's nuclear arsenal and wipe us out. There's nothing inherently wrong with that idea, it's just so uninspired. It belongs in the 90s. In fact, it's the most cliche AI plot you could come up with. Did he really have nothing else to say? Production on this film was shut down because writers went on strike to protest studio executives who would rather pump out algorithmic content than pay artists for their work. And yet, the only comment McQuarrie can muster is, what if the Terminator, except there's no robot and the hero only talks to the AI once? What a waste of such a timely concept. The entity might as well have been Gabriel or some other human villain bent on global annihilation. If I have one positive thing to say, it's that I appreciated there was at least some attempt to discuss the ways in which people would use AI as a weapon. Even though Gabriel's new motivations are never elaborated on, his desire to use it to manipulate world events at least reflects the reality of how AI is often used. Kittredge showing up in the bunker is a serviceable disruption to the plan, but his goal to control the entity is more or less the same as Gabriel's, so you just have two factions who want to do the same thing duking it out. But if you thought the villains of The Final Reckoning were mishandled, the heroes are in a whole nother league. To be fair, Mission Impossible has never been known for its character writing, but the team aspect of the series is a significant part of its appeal nevertheless. It's the thing that separates Mission from James Bond or Jason Bourne. Ethan Hunt is undoubtedly the star of the show, but he rarely works alone. Watching how the team interacts under pressure is half the fun. It's such a big part of this series that the last 4 or so movies have made the broad concept of friendship one of their central themes, and were repeatedly shown and told that Ethan will go to any lengths necessary to protect his friends. So you would think that the grand finale of the series would, I don't know, maybe feature those characters in any meaningful way, but it doesn't. The ancillary characters of the Final Reckoning aren't just flats, they're superfluous. When Dead Reckoning came out, I resisted the idea that Grace was only introduced to replace Ilsa, because for all that film's faults, I thought Grace was compelling in her own right. But the Final Reckoning has made me eat my words. She fills what was very obviously meant to be Ilsa's role in the story. And while it still would have sucked to see Ilsa be reduced to being Ethan's love interest, at least that romance would have felt organic. Series mainstay Benji Dunn doesn't fare much better either, being relegated to a drawn-out subplot in Alaska alongside the rest of the crew until the plot needs them to reconvene with Hunt for the finale. Don't get me wrong, Simon Pegg is as charming as ever, but he often works in spite of the script. Then there are newcomers, Degris and Paris, played by Greg Tarzan Davis and Pom Clementieff, respectively. Both graduate from minor players in Dead Reckoning to full-blown team members this go-around, but you wouldn't know it based on their screen time. I'd say they're just there to round out the numbers, but by the third act, I mean, the team is a veritable clown car. I got serious Jurassic World Dominion flashbacks watching all 7 of them run around in the caves. It's extremely telling that Tremel Tillman and Katie O'Brien somehow managed to leave a bigger impression on audiences in their minor roles than either of the new main players. Ethan Hunt is just about the only character who manages to show some dimension, but even then, he's probably the least interesting he's ever been. If I had one overarching criticism of the McQuarrie era of Mission Impossible, it's that his films are a little too prone to hero worship. Like, yeah, I enjoy the
living manifestation of destiny
speech from Rogue Nation as much as the next guy, but as his tenure went on, the films got more and more preoccupied with mythologizing Hunt, and that reaches its zenith here. Ethan barely feels like a person anymore. He's become a borderline messianic figure that everyone can't help but fawn over. He's never wrong and never gets meaningfully challenged by those around him. The closest we get to interpersonal conflict is his confrontation with President Sloan, and even that is quickly revealed to be a front. If characterization by way of aggrandizing mythmaking floats your boat, well, you know, more power to you. But for me, it became exhausting fast. I can only watch the film glaze Ethan Hunt so many times before I start to wonder whether the film is actually just glazing Tom Cruise by proxy. That would certainly explain why he scolds one of his attackers for spending too much time on the internet.
You spent too much time on the internet!
Where he was presumably being fed outrageous lies about Ethan Hunt being a cult leader and absentee father, but I digress. But yes, once you slog through that first hour, the film offers some of the most impressive action in the entire series, which is already an extremely high bar. The submarine set piece at the halfway point is legitimately jaw-dropping. It's a testament to Cruise and McQuarrie's commitment to upping the ante with each project. The sequence comes as a welcome reprieve from the onslaught of dialogue that preceded it. For all their talk of wanting to make these movies as silent films, this is the closest they've ever gotten to realizing that dream, and it's a sight to behold. The visual storytelling is clean and efficient, and the imagery is as arrestingly beautiful as it is anxiety-inducing. For a brief moment, it felt like I was watching a much better movie. The same must be said for the film's climactic biplane sequence. While the film trips over itself to get there, the aerial acrobatics are genuinely breathtaking to behold on an IMAX screen. Not even the fact that the sequence is essentially just a beat-for-beat retread of Fallout's helicopter sequence could cheapen the visceral thrill of watching Tom Cruise straddle the line between life and death hundreds of feet in the air. Derivative or not, it is stunning. But, and there is a but, as technically impressive as both of these set pieces are, they're rendered somewhat inert by the lack of emotional and narrative stakes. They may be infinitely more elaborate and spectacular than the motorcycle chase in Rogue Nation or the cliffside brawl in Fallout, but I'd take either of those sequences over the set pieces in The Final Reckoning any day of the week, simply because those movies gave me a reason to engage with what was happening beyond just the visceral thrill. To paraphrase George Lucas for a moment, a stunt without a story is a pretty boring thing. Our investment in a stunt is downstream of our investment in the story and the characters, and this is where The Final Reckoning falters for me. Ethan Hunt speeding down a Moroccan highway isn't just exciting because it's dangerous and being done for real. It's exciting because I'm invested in Ethan and Ilsa's relationship. I'm concerned about Ethan's state of mind after watching him flatline a few minutes prior, and I care about the mission to keep the ledger from falling into Solomon Lane's hands. Yes, Ethan hanging off the wing of a biplane is inherently exciting to watch, but I'm not invested in why he's there or what he's trying to achieve because the movie has failed to coherently communicate the stakes. The sequence offers a rush of adrenaline for sure, but it's a sugar rush. I'm not emotionally engaged. If all I wanted was to watch people hanging off planes and diving into the depths of the ocean, I could watch GoPro footage on YouTube for free. A film is supposed to couch that thrill in a reason to care. At this point, it should be abundantly clear that The Final Reckoning is a bit of a mess. But of all its failings, the most egregious is that it's just kind of a bore whenever there isn't a set piece happening. It's moody and overly self-serious in a way none of the other films were, not even MI2 or Dead Reckoning. There are a few nice moments of levity, but they're ultimately drowned out by misguided attempts at profundity that fall flat more often than not. As someone who has loved just about every Mission Impossible movie to this point, even the kind of bad ones like MI2, I take no pleasure in saying this, but The Final Reckoning is just kind of a chore to sit through. Despite the absurd scale of the plots, I felt very little urgency outside of the two main action beats. Christopher McQuarrie's direction, while as competent as ever, imbues the film with this ethereal, almost dreamlike quality that doesn't quite work for the story he's telling. In a way, there's something admirable about the fact that he still wants to experiment 4 movies in, but more often than not, this decision comes at the expense of the momentum. The Mission films have always been extremely technical in their approach. They're about the craft of spycraft, and as such, they function like finely tuned machines. The fact that the film drags as much as it does is inexcusable and probably the clearest sign that McQuarrie was out of juice. I respect the man's talent immensely. He's got a lot of it, but he should have known it was time to step aside and hand the reins to new blood. Although the name and all the film's marketing bill it as such, The Final Reckoning doesn't really feel like a series capper. If you went into it not knowing it was supposedly the last one, I doubt you'd ever guess it was being sold that way. But if it truly is the end, what a disappointing way for this wonderful series to go out. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Then again, if this film is any indication of how much gas was left in the tank, maybe it's for the best that this is Ethan Hunt's Final Reckoning.